Alright, we're ready to go, so let's begin with prayer. Lord God, we thank you for the opportunity to be here at this place to study your word. Help us to learn from you and those that came before us so that we may better understand what you expect of us today and in the days to come. Amen. As I said, I call this the structure of the Bible. There are, as you know, there are two parts. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. They were named that way because the old is old and the new was newer. So you have to understand when this was put together. This was like this. We'll find out it was very early in Christian times. So new meant Jesus had been alive maybe a century and a half before they went and did this. So that's how they determined. The Old Testament has 39 books. Now, would one of you like to stand up and recite them? You mean you don't know Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi?
Yeah, I remember.
But I don't remember.
We had to stand as our confirmation class and recite them in front of the congregation.
Oh my God, I never would have made it.
So there are 39 books, and look at the time. They were written between 2300 BC and 450 BC. So there was a span there of a couple of millennia, putting all these together. Now, I want you to notice that ended at 450 BC and the New Testament started at 50 AD. That's 500 years where nothing happened. Now the New Testament, now it turns out that the 39 books, we sort of made 39 out of them. Originally there were 22, but what they did is they split some of them up. So they ended up with 39. New Testament, there are 27 books written between 50 AD and 100 AD, just 50 years. And who's going to recite what those are?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Oh.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, and Revelation. Our pastor used to say, once you guys get to that 1 John, man, you got it nailed. But anyway, you can see that the whole thing was written at the end of the 1st century. And it hasn't been changed since. Make sense to everybody?
So the first New Testament was written in what language?
Mostly Greek. Or at least, because at the time, everybody spoke Greek. Anybody remember why everybody spoke Greek?
They kind of...
They made them do it.
Yeah, Alexander the Great conquered everybody, and he said from now on, since Greek is the best language in the world, you're all going to learn it. So anyway...
some people like to say, well, the King James is best because it was the first one written, and it's like, no, it wasn't the first one.
No, not that. We won't. We'll get into that sometime later.
First English.
It's the first time anybody all the English translations were put together in one place.
Yeah.
Okay, the structure of the Old Testament. First of all, the Old Testament books are not in time order. They are not in time order. They never were intended to be. The first 5 books is called the Torah or the Pentateuch. You've probably heard the word Torah before. That is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those are the books of the law. Now, how many of you seen the movie 10 Commandments?
Yeah.
How many remember last seen the 10 Commandments? When Moses is talking to Sephora and says, I will not enter the promised land, what's the next thing he says? Here are the 5 books I just wrote. Now make sure that they are protected for the future. Supposedly Moses wrote all 5 of those. We don't know. As far as the people that put together the King James Version, they're convinced that Moses wrote all 5 of them. But all of those have to do mostly with the law. Numbers is an interesting one. Anybody know why it's called Numbers?
Isn't it the census?
Yeah, exactly. There was a census taken at the beginning of it and a census taken at the end of it to show how many people of God there were. Now, where Deuteronomy came from, I don't know. Leviticus is the Levites tribe who were the priests and whatnot. Now, the historical books are the ones that tell you how they came to the Promised Land and what happened to them after they got there. So you can see that Joshua, Joshua's the first one. He led the taking of the Promised Land. Judges, they didn't have kings initially. They had judges that ran the country. Then Ruth is there. That's the bridge between 1st and 2nd Samuel, who is the area of the judges. And then 1st Kings and 2nd Kings, that says what they are. And then 1st Chronicles and 2nd Chronicles basically are what happened to them, as far as the exiles and all that sort of stuff. Ezra and Nehemiah, those 2 were the 2 books that were written after they returned from exile. And Esther, they didn't know where to put Esther, so they put it there. Esther was a Jewish woman involved with the Persians, so they figured that was a logical place to put it. So all of those groups are all historical books, which differs from the ones with the laws in them. Then poetic and wisdom writings, there were all kinds of these. They didn't know what to do with them, so they kind of grouped them together. Job, Psalms, Proverbs. Ever read Proverbs? There's a proverb for every minute of every day in there.
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. That one is the strange one. If you read it, some of those songs are pretty erotic. So how it got into the canon, I don't know, but there it is. Then you have the major prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Most of these were written during the exile. And then you have the minor prophets that have been scattered all over the place, and that's the group that's there. I gave you a timeline which shows you pretty much when all of these things were written. So if you start, it says 4,000 plus BC. That's when they think God created Adam and Eve, which means it was a long time ago. We're not exactly sure how far, so that's as good a number as any. Then it talks about the Tower of Babel, and then Abraham looks about 2,100 BC. Then in 1874 BC is Joseph, and then notice the Jews were in Egypt 430 years. You can see that there. And then the Exodus, and then we talk about Moses and Joshua, and then the time of the judges. And then it talks about Samuel, David, and Solomon, and when they were written. And you can see when some of the other minor prophets start showing up on the second line there. And you get an idea of where this is all going on. Now you also notice that about 331, or 450 is 430, and then between there and 331, all activity stops with this. And you can see why, because Alexander dies in Babylon, Grecian Empire is divided, Ptolemy taking Egypt, and so on. Then the Seleucids of Syria govern Palestine, and then Judas Maccabeus takes it back, and then the Romans conquer them. So by about 4 BC, the Romans are pretty well established. Why do I talk about Judas Maccabeus? Anybody know what the Apocrypha is?
It's the books of the Bible that the Catholics believe in, that we don't, because we don't think they were inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. And they were written about that time. And the first Maccabees and second Maccabees were 2 of them. I mean, there's a book of wisdom, there's a book of Esdras. If you're in a Catholic church, the Catholic Bible will have them in there. Our Bible does not. But you can buy them with the Apocrypha in it. So that's why once these minor prophets are done with, on the timeline, it's like for 500 years, nothing happens. So here's the Old Testament history. You have the early times. That's when Noah, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph were running around. The timeline shows you slavery in Egypt happened next. Then the Exodus was Moses, Joshua, who actually crossed into the Promised Land. By the way, if you saw the Ten Commandments, you know John Derek played Joshua in a 1950s film. And he was married to Bo Derek in the 1980s. I won't mention anymore. And that's when the 12 tribes came about. Now, why are there 12 tribes? How many sons did Jacob have? 12. Each one of them was a tribe. Now, there are some people who claim there were actually 13 and all this other stuff, but we all know in the Bible that numbers divisible by 4 are very important.
And 7.
For there's 4 Gospels and, 12 tribes.
7's important too.
So then the judges came along. That's when you hear about people like Eli and Samuel. The judges were just kind of, they were kind of like the lawgivers. Whenever there was a dispute, you'd go to the judge, and the judge kind of ran everything. There was a female judge in there. Anybody remember who she was?
Not Deborah, no.
Her name was Deborah.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was Deborah.
So there were a lot of judges. They weren't the only 2. Then after that, the combined kingdom of Israel and Judah, that was, Saul was the first king. As you recall, God didn't like Saul at the end, so David took over, and then Solomon, his son, took over after that. The story of David that's laid out in the Kings and the Chronicles is a very, very interesting story, because, David was an outlaw for years. But who was his best friend? Jonathan, who was Saul's son. So so Saul was kind of, totally oblivious to what was going on as far as that was concerned. And then Solomon started out doing the right thing, and then, what they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's what happened to him. So when Solomon died, they got into a big fight as to who the next king would be. So the kingdom was split into 2. The northern kingdom, that's where you had Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah. You remember Elijah, don't you? All the stories about him. Well, that was the northern kingdom. And then the southern kingdom, which is what we know Judah, that's where the kings were. Hezekiah and people like that. Joash, and that's his name, Joash. And the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria, and they just disappeared from the map. They were never back again. And that's why, the area became called Samaria, and that's why the southern kingdom wanted nothing to do with them, because all the people that were left were all pagans and, weren't worth their trouble anyway. The southern kingdom was conquered by Babylon, and that's when Jeremiah wrote most of his book as to, what was going on around that time. And then Ezekiel and Daniel were both written when the southern kingdom was in exile. If you recall the story of Daniel, he was sort of like Joseph was to Pharaoh, and he interpreted the handwriting on the wall and all of that good fun stuff. And then you had the guys in the furnace who were.
Meshach.
That's one of them.
Abednego.
That's two of them.
Shadrach.
Shadrach was the third one.
Yeah.
In Sunday school, we had to learn how to sing a song about them. So that's when all of that happened. And then the southern kingdom returned home, and that's when Ezra and Nehemiah wrote their books. Ezra's book was about how you re-educate the people because they had nothing written. So how do you make people understand what the old text said and everything else? Well, the book of Ezra talks about how he, the high priest, did that. And the book of Nehemiah, he was the general, and he was the one that rebuilt the walls and everything so that they could, keep out invaders and whatnot. Didn't really work, but it was a nice story. Then you had the silent times, as I told you. You could see it on the timeline there when the Syrians, the Maccabees, and the Romans were in charge. So that's the whole timeline for the Old Testament.
I got a question.
Sure.
And I'm gonna have dumb questions.
So go ahead.
about this. So the difference between history and a canon.
Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, the Old Testament canon, you had all of these books, and you had a bunch of other ones that were written by all kinds of people. What the canon was deciding which got in and what got out. So this group of people, in this case, they were specialized scholars, called the Sopherim, at 500 BC, there's that 500 again, copied the ancient texts, and they decided what books were going to be in the Old Testament Bible. And how they decided, they were the experts. How they got that way, I don't really know. But they decided from that from that point forward that the books that we see in the Old Testament are going to be the official ones. Like I said, there was a bunch of other ones that
What happened to those books, the other ones that didn't get in?
They're around somewhere. I know they kept, there was a library in Alexandria, Egypt, that kept a lot of that stuff, and there was a fire. But the point of the matter was, they're around. Then the Septuagint, I don't speak Greek. 70 Greek scholars translated the Hebrew text into Greek, and that's the Bible, Old Testament Bible that we recognize. The Gospel writers when they recorded from the Old Testament, that is the one they were quoting from. So that's what the canon is. Somebody gets together and decides, these books are for real. Remember what was it you said before about, why the Apocrypha?
Well, I don't know how they did it, but the New Testament definitely was related to, did we believe that the Holy Spirit inspired that or not?
Exactly. Now, in the case of the Old Testament, it was, did they believe that God inspired it? But that was the idea. Then there was Flavius Josephus, and he was quite a character. He was like the #1 historian as far as the Jewish people were concerned. He came up with 22 books, but we split them up later on, and it came to 39 we have. They were the same texts, but they liked to keep them in smaller books back then because they were copying them on papyrus, and that was less work. Remember, in those days, when they copied stuff, there was no punctuation marks and no spaces.
Sounds like my grandmother when she wrote letters. It's like,
So-
okay, where'd that sentence in? Where'd this one in?
So basically, it's this long scroll with nothing but characters on it. So Flavius Josephus, he's the one that most people refer to when they talk about secular proof that all of this stuff happened. In fact, if you watch the Ten Commandments, it's on the Saturday before Easter usually. It says in the beginning, from the testimony of Flavius Josephus, and the next screen says, the Holy Bible. So that's who Flavius Josephus was. Now, the New Testament's a little different. You have the 4 Gospels in the front, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're not alphabetical. They had a little problem here because Matthew, Mark, and Luke pretty much follow each other. John is the oddball. Now, as we went through John, you notice most of the book of John concentrates on the last week of Jesus' life. Whereas the rest went back historically. Matthew and Luke actually had a birth story. Mark did not. They believe Mark had, it was actually John Mark, might have written his first, and others added to what he wrote. Now, here's the only historical book is the Acts of the Apostles. And we studied that, and how, all of Paul's journeys are laid out, all of Peter's journeys are laid out. In fact, Luke and the Act of the Apostles were actually one book. And they split them up. Well, that's what caused the problem, because now, in theory, John should have been ahead of Luke, because the other two books would have flowed into each other, but that's the way they chose to do it. The epistles, which are, is a nice fancy word for letters. The letters of Paul, there's the whole list of them. The letters of Peter, even, you can argue one way or the other whether he really wrote them or not. And then you had two of Jesus' half-brothers, James and Jude, who wrote letters. And then the letters of unknown authors. And notice 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John are on that list, because they can't tell whether John the Apostle or John the Elder or there's a third one that could possibly been one of those three. So, in Hebrews, there was a big to-do on Jeopardy. Anybody remember this? It was not too long ago. The question, and final Jeopardy question was, which letter written by Paul has the most quotes to the Old Testament in it? And their answer was the Hebrews. Well, guess what? No biblical scholar that I can find ever said that Paul ever wrote it. And every biblical scholar in our presbytery said he didn't. And so they got a lot of grief for that answer. And they came back and said, well, at the front of the King James Bible of Hebrews, it says Paul wrote it, so that's what we're going by. But right now, no one's really sure who wrote that one. It's a good book, but nobody knows who did it. And then prophecy is the end there is Revelation. It doesn't fit anything that came before it or after it.
And it's written by John.
We think, yes. We think that John wrote this on the Isle of Patmos when he was in exile. If he did, he had to be well into his 90s when he wrote it. Now, when I say wrote, that usually means it was dictated and there was a secretary or somebody like that actually wrote it down. So that's how the New Testament is structured. Again, it's not necessarily in time order, because I think Galatians is the first letter he actually wrote. So it predated Romans and the Corinthians, but it tells a story. Now, there were lots and lots and lots of books around New Testament time. There was one that said that Jesus performed miracles when he was 10 years old. He made birds come to life and all kinds of things like that. There was others about some of the disciples and what the travels they made and so on and so forth. Well, there were three tests that they decided to put into the canon. The first one was the book had to be directly connected to Jesus or an apostle. So the Gospels were all connected to Jesus, so they were it. Paul's letters were connected to an apostle because he said so. He declared himself an apostle. So all his letters declared that they were, connected to an apostle, so they were it. Then with names like 1 Peter and 2 Peter, I guess they were it. The next test was orthodox doctrine. At the time this was done, they knew what was right and what was wrong. And if there was anything in any of those other books that did not agree with what the doctrine was at the time, it was out. Now those books, Becky, are around somewhere. You can read them. But there are some real zingers out there. Then there's broad-based acceptance. you know, the other part of it is, remember, they started churches all over the place, and as long as all the Christians in the world said that this sounds good to us, that was the third test. So when you went through all three of those tests, there was they narrowed it down, okay? So then there was the Synod of Laodicea. That was in 363 AD. A bunch of monks got together, I guess, and they said, "Okay, let's do this once and for all." So they went through the whole list, and all these people did was decided what was out. There was still this body; they hadn't decided what was in yet. But that group said these are definitely out. So they had the easy part. Then the Synod of Hippo, that's what it was called. The actual name of the town was Hippolydius. It was somewhere in North Africa. But then they decided now, from the ones that were left, these are the 27 that are in. The last three were that were titled 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. There was still a big debate about whether those were actually, passed the test or not. Then the Synod of Carthage refined that a little bit. And finally, the Council of Carthage, which was the higher church people, affirmed the 27 books that we have today. So so it took them 400 years, or no, 300 years, I guess, to take all those writings and decide what was important and what wasn't.
So they did that. That's 300 and some years after Jesus died, they finally got it done. In the meantime, the people that were, quote, Christians were going on whatever they had.
Okay, exactly. And there was all kinds of people running around, espousing various different things. And for example, we talked about why the Jews were so hated. There was one, I forget which one it was. One of the saints decreed that in like the 4th century, somewhere in this time, and it was part of Catholic law until the 1960s. So there were a lot of people running around that were saying that this is what is going on and whatnot. But once they established the 27 books, now they had a problem. How do you get the 27 books to the people? Well, that's what monasteries were for. They were hand copying copies of the text. Don't you remember the commercial where the guy's doing that and oops, I made a mistake, I gotta start over? And he's like halfway through with the flowery print and everything. But that's what monasteries were for. That's why like for example, Monte Cassino, you remember Monte Cassino? Mm-hmm. That's why they didn't want to bomb that, because there were all kinds of old texts that had been hand copied in there. And they knew they would lose them if that were to happen. So for years, that is the way that the Bible.
So all they did was just sit there and write that stuff?
Yeah, exactly. That's all they did. Remember, in order to be in a monastery, you had to have a task. You ever see Whoopi Goldberg in Sister Act?
Mm-hmm.
Remember they had to define what her task was, and I think she didn't like her first task, so they made her choir minister. So everybody has to have a task. So these people, that's what they did. They copied and copied and copied. Now.
And then you can see why the Jewish people were so into oral.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
It's kind of hard to do written all the time. And what if the written got lost, or you were in captivity and the written was destroyed? And
well, exactly. And that was. Did any of you ever see the follow-up to Roots?
I don't know if I did or not.
Yeah, remember he's in the village that he thinks he's from, and there is the one elder whose job it was to maintain by memory the history of the tribe. And he sat there, remember how long he said it was like 2 days he's going through this whole thing? And finally the Kunta Kinte story comes out. And he realizes that, there's a lot of truth to this, because, they didn't tell him what he was looking for. But
Alex Haley.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
But that was how it was done. Well, like I said, the original texts from the Jewish ones were all on what they call codex, and Dr. Peel has his own personal codex, and he'll show it to you, and it's all symbols going across. Remember the paper tapes they used to use to store programs with the holes in them? That's what it looked like. It looked like something like about that wide, and all it was just nothing but characters. That's why the Septuagint that we talked about was so important, because they actually translated it into something people could read. And then from there on, it became easier and easier to do. What was the one invention that made the Bible as we know it available? The printing press.
Yeah.
Gutenberg's printing press. And so Martin Luther heard about that, and when he translated the Bible into German, he went to Gutenberg, who was also a good German fellow, and printed a bunch of them. And that is how the Bible became a part of the people, because prior to that, the only people who had them were who? Right. Well, who's writing them? The priests were the only ones that had them. They weren't selling them or anything. I mean, basically, that's the only ones they had, and they were in Latin, and they were the only ones that understood what it said. And when you went to worship, you had to listen to the whole thing in Latin, even if you didn't know how to speak it.
I took 2 years of Latin as worthless.
Well, like I said, when I grew up, I was half Italian, and the only relatives, my mother's relatives, were not around. So the only relatives I had were my dad's. So anytime there was a first communion, a funeral, a wedding, any of those things, we had to go to a Catholic church, and we were totally lost. The whole thing was done in Latin. Everything. The responses were in Latin.
Everything's in Latin. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so everybody in the congregation knew that when the priest said this, you said that.
Right, but that's just because you're used to it. To say
You had to go to catechism for 8 years
Yeah.
for something.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
you had a pamphlet
Yeah.
that translated.
Yeah.
There was also, they had the missal, and there was a couple other things.
Yeah.
But the reality of it was, until 1965, I believe, it was all done in Latin, regardless of whether you were English or
Well, they told us to take 2 years of Latin because that was going to help you with another language, except believing it.
Well, all it does, if you're a pharmacist, you have to take Latin, because all those
Yeah.
names.
Oh yeah, it's really
But-
hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, but the point I'm making here is that for years, the Bible was just something that the priests knew. They had no idea, the average person had no idea about any of this. And the Bible was very well protected, especially in cathedrals. There was a monk whose job it was to protect that text. And if you watch in a Catholic service, usually the person who reads the priest who reads the Bible, there's a guy holding it for him while he reads it. And that is that person's responsibility. It was the same way in the synagogue. There was the person who was responsible for the scrolls, making sure that they were protected, because it's the only set they had. And so that's basically how the Bible got put together. And that's why all this Old Testament stuff is old. Well, they stopped writing it in 500 BC. I don't think any of you were around for that. But 500 BC is when they stopped adding to it. So all of those old texts go back that far. And that's when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Rosetta Stone and all these other things. They're all connected into these at some point or another. Now, based on all of that, the surveys I got that actually answered something, the only consensus was the Book of Ruth. That at least 2 people picked.
There's a wide variety of people.
Yeah, so we will start with that one. It's very short. Ladies, you'll love it. It's a love story, sort of. It's a love story with a good message. And also, there was a movie. Anybody see the movie? The story of Ruth. My mother made me watch that. Had to see it, we saw it at a drive-in.
I don't like those movies, I'm sorry.
You don't like what?
I don't like those religious movies, I
Yeah.
don't watch them.
Well, we also had to watch, we had to go downtown as a high history.
Yeah.
Did you get,
Questions.
did you give,
Yeah,
yeah, this is
yeah.
the one you gave us. I didn't pick anything because I didn't know anything, so.
So anyway,
When was that?
Give it to us a couple.
yeah,
I never had.
well, you must not have been around
They
then.
went around, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, next time we will start with the Book of Ruth, and like I say, it's kind of short, but it's a good one, and it's got a very, very powerful message. And it also has to do with the fact that Ruth herself ends up playing a role in the overall history of this that was not obvious when the book started. So keep that in mind as well, that there's actually some historical significance to this story. There was a whole lot of people that picked just, one of you picked a single book and the rest didn't pick it, and couldn't figure out how to decipher all that because it was all over the place.
Yeah.
But
No, I don't know.
that will be,
exactly.
yeah, that will be
There were a
the,
lot of choices.
once we get into it, then we'll do this again and see what other books we would like to go
That
after.
was a survey.
For example, you picked Joshua because that's the, that was your first
That's
choice.
what's on
Yeah.
the list.
Renee wants to talk about Daniel because there's actually some information about the end times in that one.
Yeah, I'm doing different things lately in my spare time, and so now I'm reading a book by Ron Rhodes about the end times. But I read another one by a guy named Amir Larmadi. He's a Jewish guy, so I've been reading a little of that just for interest,
Well, the point of the matter is that Daniel is actually three entirely different books. There's the part about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and then Daniel with his head in the lion's mouth. And then there's the part where he does some interpretations for the king, and then there's this third part that talks about the time to come. So it's a different book. Another one, some other person said the Book of Job. That has 42 chapters in it. And it's really an interesting book. It's about how this poor guy Job gets picked, and they decide to see how many calamities you can put on the guy before he loses it.
It was on the list.
And it's another interesting book. But the 38th chapter of Job is very powerful stuff. So we'll start with the Book of Ruth, which is kind of easy. And it's a story you can get into, and the rest will follow along. But anyway, I just figured I'd show you exactly how all of this stuff got put together, and I was hoping somebody else could name all the books.
And then when Martin Luther did the whole reform thing, he threw some of the books out.
Yeah, he like I said,
I mean, some of the ones that the Catholics used, is he the one that threw them out?
yeah, he decided he didn't want them.
And Maccabees and some of those he threw out.
And then when King James pulled together all the biblical scholars, they chose not to include them either. If you recall in the history of England at that time, they couldn't figure out whether they were Catholic or Protestant, because every time